John here with Ripewave Audio, and this time to talk about Emotiva's full range of BasX entry-level AV processor and receivers that they have. And we feel this is a good time because this summer they did launch the latest model in this, the MR1L. This comes after a few months when the MR1 was announced at the beginning of this year. Now, we announced the MR1 back when it was launched around this January timeframe. Now, we had the intent of bringing one in. We're still waiting for that from Emotiva. We'll have to hit them up again. But the first model that came into play here was the MC1, the processor only that came out the last year. So let's look at these all together now as a family and compare them against their premium range, which stems from the RMC-1, which of course you know we have in-house here as the RMC-1, the RMC-1L, and the XMC-2, all processors, but that's their premium line. And then how does this BasX line match up? And this is what we'll do in this video. Now let's take a look first at the MC1. This is the lowest cost processor or receiver that they have in their range. This is a processor. It sells for $1,099. It's capable of processing 15 channels. So what does this mean? It's 13 base level speakers plus 2 subwoofers, and that gives you a total of 15. Emotiva does clarify in their manuals what those subwoofer outputs do. They say it has 2 balanced outputs and 2 unbalanced outputs. All outputs deliver the same information. However, you can set independent trim and distance settings for subwoofer 1 and subwoofer 2. So therefore, we give it credit for being independently controllable subwoofer outputs. And this is the same you'll see on all their models, right? So this is what it looks like. This is a very slim, this is the most compact model that they have as a processor or receiver. This is a processor, as we said. It's got this newer style remote over what we currently have with the RMC-1 series. And you'll look at the back of this, it's pretty clean. It's gets straight to business. Not a lot of legacy support, but they do give you 4 analog. All the outputs are unbalanced except for the subwoofers. And this is something I mentioned, which was interesting when we did the Yamaha review, is the balanced outputs they gave were only for the front channels, which are usually closer to the receiver and less likely to have noise. But subwoofers can be placed anywhere in the room. So having the balanced option for subwoofers where it's running longer distances, I feel is a good addition here. As far as the front cosmetics on this, just a simple dot matrix 2-line display, but we are still seeing that on a lot of products, even those that still command a premium price. So display technologies, even though they've come a long ways with our smart devices, haven't really fully been adopted within the AV world, although we do see a couple of examples from Anthem and so forth. So those are coming. And then this, as we said before, was introduced in 2022. So then that brings us to the newest model in this series, which is the BasX MR1L. And when Emotiva puts an L after it, they mean light or lower or whatever, but you're getting less of what's in the base model, which is the MR1. But let's look at the MR1L as we build up from the least capable to the most capable units here. So also 15 channels of processing, 13.2. They put the same note in the manual as they did with the MC1. This unit sells for $1,599. It's amplification. Now, Emotiva has not come out with a receiver in a while until this year. So they're back with receivers. And these are the first receivers from Emotiva that really address the immersive market, that give you height channels as well. But this particular model is 9 channels of amplification. We will get into the speaker layouts this does support. If you're only driving 2 channels, it's 140 watts per channel. But I really appreciate that Emotiva has gone to the extent of publishing all channels driven rating for this. So all 9 channels driven of these Class AB amplifiers at the same time will give you an output of 85 watts. So what you get with this is your front stage, left, right, and center. You get side surrounds, you get front heights and rear heights. Like the Marantz and Denon and all these others that give you only 9 channels of amplification, you do end up with one short if you're really doing a full 7.x.4 configuration, which is kind of the sweet spot nowadays. We still have the 2-line display that we saw in the MC1, but this time, it breathes a little bit more because this is a taller unit and it's behind this plastic that extends really where the knob is and for the volume, etc. So it gives that good look. And of course, all of these have the same industrial design as Emotiva has used for the last decade or so, all black and the rack mount looking ends there. So this is consistent if you were to fit it in with any other Emotiva component from the last 10 years. Before that, they were a little different finishes with the side pieces being silver. This gives you essentially the same I/O on the back, except for now you've got the amplifier connections here. So it's still the balanced and unbalanced subwoofer connections and unbalanced for everything else. Similarly, the flagship of this range, the BasX range, the MR1, gives you that same I/O, but this time with 11 channels of amplification. This unit sells for just $1 short of $2,000. Also a 13.2 or 15 channels of processing, just like the others. The power rating is higher than the MR1L. So for the MR1, it's 11, not only 2 additional channels, but 11 by 160 watts for 2 channels driven, and 100 watts per channel, all channel driven, all 11 channels driven, again, Class AB amplifiers. Now this unit is obviously taller, but possess the same cosmetics, that 2-line display, etc. So they've got this very consistent design language with these units. Now, looking at these side by side, we can definitely see how these get bigger as you add amplifiers to them. Of course, the MC1 with no amplification as a processor only, the MR1L, which adds 9 channels of amplification, and the MR1 with 11 channels of amplification is the tallest. And we see that each of these have an antenna sticking up out of the back. It's just a single antenna. We'll talk about what that gives you a little later on. Looking inside these models, the MC1 is very sparse. You just have this board at the back here for all your I/O, and then you have your power supply in there, and it looks like a switch mode power supply and a lot of empty space. And of course, we've seen even some other bigger units like from Arcam that look pretty sparse as well, but this one is pretty thin, so this is very condensed in here. When you look at the MR1L, it introduces a toroidal power supply, and so that is in there. And the power supply looks a little bigger on the MR1, also toroidal power supply on that. And you can see that there's more space in there for the amplifiers that you have to get the 2 additional channels in the MR1. The website does include a few more close-ups of the components for the MR1L and the MR1. You can notice that the capacitors, although looks like the same in each of those models, instead of having 4 in the MR1L, there's 6 shown there in the MR1. So just a little bit more of the same there. And we can see here that it's using some quality components inside of this. On to the layout comparison, and we're going to compare this against the RMC-1 series. This also includes the XMC-2, just to show you what you get different by moving from the flagship range to the BasX range with Emotiva, but our focus will be on the BasX range. But I think this is a good time for us to do this because we really hadn't gone through the Emotiva processor range since we've been doing this for the last few years. In this way, it got covered a couple times, mixed in with other brands, but here as a dedicated piece, I think this is a good chance to also show the RMC-1 XMC-2 products. So as we say, the speaker layouts are consistent per model range. So the RMC-1, when we say RMC-1, we're also going to include the XMC. So the RMC-1 range and the BasX range, they each have that common speaker layout. So for RMC-1, you can get up to a 9.1.6, or if you have additional subwoofers and less rows of heights, you can do a 9.3.4. So that is your flexibility there. Of course, everything has to be externally powered with the RMC-1 range. Now, over the BasX range, the MR1 powers everything with 11 channels. So you have the capability of doing a 7.2.4 configuration with everything powered within the MR1. They also give you an additional set of outputs if you want to do a third row of heights. So it is possible to handle a 7.2.6 configuration with the BasX range, provided you have an external amplifier. So that is good to have that flexibility to expand, but no ability to expand to front wides as you can with the RMC-1 range. So you get power on the 7 bass channels, 4 heights, and then if you want a third row of heights, you got to power those externally for that middle row. With the MC1, which is all of processor, it's the same layout, but everything has to be powered externally. So factor in the fact that while you're spending $1,100, it's the lowest price unit, you still got to buy your amplifiers. So depending on how you pair that, it could certainly, clearly would bring you at a higher price in most cases than the MR1 when you combine the amplifiers. So those MR1 and MR1L are a good bargain as a receiver with everything all in one. As far as format support, they all support Dolby Atmos and they all support DTS:X, but that's where the format support ends. So no DTS:X Pro and no Aural 3D support. Now, a couple of omissions you'll see in the BasX range that you have in the RMC-1 range. There is no headphone jack on the front of this, and there is no AM/FM tuner. And they all have auto switching power supplies where you can plug in, whether it's 110 volts or 240 volts, wherever you are in the world, this will auto adjust. So there's no switches, there's no specific model from the factory. This will work anywhere in the world. None of these support IMAX Enhanced. They all support Dolby Vision. Main differences come with the room calibration between these two, which is the BasX range use Emotiva's own EmoQ. This is a technology that they've had out in their processors and receivers for a long time, and it wasn't until the RMC-1 range where they introduced Dirac support. But EmoQ has been a technology of theirs for a while, not regarded as a good of a solution as what Dirac Live is, although we have not used it in-house here. From what I understand, none of these have any real bass control option, and none of them have THX certification. That we only see in the Onkyo and Integra products this time in the world. As far as the DACs, clear difference between the two ranges. The BasX range is all Cirrus Logic chips. They're the CS42528. Each of these chips support 8 channels, so there's at least 2 of these in each of the receivers or processors to give you the full 15 channels of processing. Now, with the flagship range, the RMC-1 range, you have AKM chips, the 4490 chips, 16 of these chips in the RMC-1 and RMC-1L, and 10 of them in the XMC-2. So you get the fully differential, fully balanced experience with the RMC-1. The XMC-2 only does the fully balanced differential on the front channels, and so forth. You have less of that chip, but it is the same chip. Now, Emotiva will be upgrading the RMC-1 hardware. They say it was going to come this summer. We haven't heard anything more since announcements earlier this year. And well, actually started, I think, around November last year where we started hearing about it. But the RMC-1 Plus series, understand, is going to move to a different DAC. I think a Texas Instrument. We'll wait for those details as these are released. But the difference on the chip itself, you know, the AKM gives you 120 decibels versus the Cirrus Logic is 114. And the THD plus N is a negative 112 decibels versus negative 100. So clear performance differences on the chip itself, as well as the number of channels each of are handling. You can get a sense for why the RMC-1 range is more expensive, because it's using more of these chips and more expensive chips. All of them do support PCM conversion. Now, and the RMC-1, that's up to 768 kilohertz. On the Cirrus Logic chip, you only have 192 kilohertz on that. Now, DSD support is only on the AKM chip, not on the Cirrus Logic. So when it comes down to it, you're going to have different specifications. Unfortunately, we can't find published specifications for their flagship on signal-to-noise and THD, although for the BasX range, they have published 115 dBs for signal-to-noise and a THD of less than 0.05%. On PCM conversion, so we have what the chip will handle, but actually programmed and outputted to support 24,384 hertz on the RMC-1 range, and then 24,192 on the BasX range. The BasX has no support for DSD versus the RMC-1 has DSD 256 support. Let's look at the I/O here. Another difference is on the HDMI. The RMC-1 gives you 8 in, 2 out versus the BasX 6 in, 2 out. So 2 less HDMI inputs on the BasX range. For the digital inputs, you have 4 coax, 4 Toslink, and 1 out of each for RMC-1 versus on the BasX, you only have 2 coax and 2 Toslink optical in. The RMC-1 has an AES EBU input. Now, this is usually only seen in professional gear. I don't have a current use case for it. Curious if any of you utilize that port, but it's something we only see in a few models in the world, obviously not present in the BasX range. For multi-channel output, the RMC-1 range gives you 16 channels balanced, versus on the BasX, you're only getting the 2 subwoofer outputs balanced, and the outputs are mainly on unbalanced RCA 13.2. There is a balanced input on the RMC-1, and there's no balanced inputs on the BasX range. The RMC-1 has 3 analog RCA inputs. Now here's where the BasX has a little bit more. They have 4 analog inputs on the BasX. So less digital inputs, but more analog inputs, 1 more. And there is a zone output on all of these models. There is a zone output on the RMC-1 models and not the BasX. There is no composite or component video output, so only HDMI outputs on these models. Now, the RMC-1 flagship model does have some expansion modules. Now, we don't have as many as they originally advertised, but there is a phono card option, and there's also options for more balanced inputs if you should need them. But it's only in that one model. And so everything else, you need an external phono preamplifier if you have a record player. A little bit deeper dive on the video, and there isn't much really to dive into here. These are all still currently 4K units. So this is a HDMI 2.0 B standard on all of these, 60 frames per second, 4K. As we said, 8 in, 2 out for the RMC1. BasX is 6 in, 2 out with these. And we're seeing eARC support, but that is it. So all the 2.1 features are not available. This does support HDR. There is Dolby Vision support. As we said, no IMAX. All the copy protection is 2.2, not 2.3. As far as networking, very little here. So there is an Ethernet port on the RMC1 range, but not on the BasX range. If you need to upgrade any of these units, you're going to be doing them through a USB port. These are not upgradable over the internet, any of these models, even though there's an Ethernet port on the RMC1. That's used predominantly for control use with the Dirac Live system. So that's what the Ethernet port is for on the RMC1 range. But that doesn't even exist on the BasX range. And we don't know if it's 10/100 or gigabit, but I think it's 10/100 on the RMC1. As far as wireless technologies, we talked about the antennas being on the BasX. There's no antennas on the RMC1. There's no wireless capability, whether it's Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, on the RMC1. What the Bluetooth antenna does on the BasX is it's Bluetooth in. So if you have a tablet, a smartphone, you can stream from that, but it has to be over aptX. And the only unit that shows support for aptX HD is the new MR1L. And I'm wondering if that is just because it's newer and they just didn't update the literature for the others, or if it's truly only that model. So that's something that would be good to confirm, of whether the MC1 and the MR1 also support aptX HD. But there's no Bluetooth out to headphones or speakers or soundbars or anything like that. And no other fancy networking capabilities. Now, we understand what's also coming with the RMC1 Plus series is some more networking capabilities, perhaps wireless. So we will wait and see. They do talk about some streaming coming to their products. But it's a capability we don't really care too much about, but some of you might. So this is why we talk about it. Obviously, with the lack of networking, the voice control stuff is not supported in any of these units. And you can do protocol control through the Ethernet port, through infrared on the RMC1. The BasX line is doing its control through serial DB9 connection. There's also a difference on the triggers. The RMC1 range, 4 trigger outs. I'm using them all. I've got amplifiers, Emotiva amplifiers, and subwoofers all over the place, and we're making use of all 4 of them. Now, before I had the RMC1, I was using 1/8-inch phono splitter with success. It will all depend because every time you split it, you're going to have a voltage drop there, and whether you've degraded the signal too much. That would be a trial and error to see if that actually works. There's other devices you can buy that maintain the power that's a little more sophisticated than the hack that I did. But the BasX range only gives you 1 trigger output. Now, generally speaking, on the MR1, you can power everything but a 3rd row of heights, 1 trigger output for that, or maybe it's a trigger output for your subs. So that's probably what they're thinking about. But again, this is the BasX range. Streaming ecosystems, no claim support there, obviously, due to the lack of networking. The Bluetooth is really just from streaming from your phone. Same thing with the internet streaming, no supported claims on any of that. Of course, if you have these services on your phone, stream them on over to the BasX range, but you don't have that capability with the MR1. So you have to use a streaming device, and that's what we do. We use an Apple TV. We also have a WIM Mini and a WIM Pro. Just it can bring all this stuff in. So that's the workaround if you care about these services. The remotes. We have the remote that comes with our RMC1. This is the same one for the 1L and the XMC2. This is a heavy industrial unit. No backlight. The buttons are a little clicky, but I kind of like it. I know where all the buttons are. This kind of nice because I have independent buttons for the trim, center, sub, surround, height. It's nice to have those right at my disposal. So I find this remote to be very functional. Plus, I have direct access to all my inputs versus like on the Yamaha where I have to scroll through all the HDMI inputs if I haven't set up scenes. So I highly recommend setting up scenes on the Yamaha unit. What they've done with the newer BasX receivers and processors is produced a new remote. It looks to be more on the plastic side, although we haven't brought one of these in, but it also has a backlight. And I can see there's a button there to enable a backlight on this unit. And it does seem like it has the buttons that will take you to the individual inputs. So they did preserve some of that. It looks like they're giving you the same trim buttons, just laid out a little differently than the PR1 remote that comes with the flagship range. So they have preserved some capabilities on this. Some of the things we don't see on the BasX range is looks like we don't have a loudness button, which I use occasionally. So occasionally I do like hitting that button. Now, finally, we have the dimensions and everything. And as we saw from the pictures before, you can kind of get the story here is it moves up in size from the MC1 up to the biggest unit, which is the RMC1, which is 7.5 inches, 190 millimeters on the height, depth of 15.5 inches, 394 millimeters, 17 inches wide. They're all 17 inches wide, 432 millimeters on the width, so constant width on all these. But then they go down from size there, and the smallest one is the MC1, which is only 3.2 inches, 79 millimeters, 13 inches deep, 330 millimeters. Otherwise, it's the same there. And the weights, now naturally, the one with the most amplifiers is the heaviest, the MR1, 50 pounds, 22.7 kilograms. And the lightest is the MC1 in the same series, 10 pounds, 4.5 kilograms, and everything else is in between there. Part of this is knowing that there's a toroidal power supply in the MR1 and the MR1L. That's why those are heavier, and the other ones with the switch mode power supply are lighter. So even my RMC1 is only 24 pounds, 10.9 kilograms, mostly in part because of the power supply being a switch mode power supply. They don't publish power consumption and standby power consumption. What we do know is that the flagship range is made and assembled in the United States with internationally sourced components. And the BasX range, I believe they're all made in China. I don't have a firm confirmation on that, but I think from all the chatter on the internet and everything, that is the case. The flagship range, they give you a 5-year warranty, and then on the BasX, a 3-year warranty. Now, a quick look at the UI, nothing special here. The flagship range is even, just all really text-driven menus. You don't have that graphical experience, which we see with so many products today. When we looked at the Marantz and the Denon and the Onkyo and the Yamaha, we get more graphical experience. But these are all text driven. And so the differences between the RMC1 and the BasX are not much different. While the BasX menus on screen display look similar, there's still a text-based driven menu system. There's no capabilities to bring this to a tablet, or because there's no Wi-Fi connection. There's no Bluetooth transmitter. So until they get that sorted out, and if you put the IP address of these in to the RMC1, you don't get any UI from that as well. So you just have the on-screen display on this. Calibration process is different. So with the RMC1, it's direct, so it's running on a separate computer. That's where the Ethernet is used, versus the BasX range using EmoQ. You plug the microphone directly into the unit, meaning the receiver, the processor, and the screens are driven as an on-screen display, so there's no additional PC or tablet needed to run the calibration with EmoQ. So certainly more budget oriented for that. So this wraps it up for Emotiva and what they have available right now. As I alluded to, they're getting ready to come out with an updated version of the RMC1 range. These will be their Plus version. Understand they're replacing 80+% of the components within that, so this will be all new. For existing owners, they're going to make it available to uptrade, so for a fee to be able to turn in their old model and get a new model back. And that could work out very well for people who are looking for the latest thing. And I think it's going to unlock some of the features that have been missing. So we're waiting to see on the final details. I don't want to report out too much on that because unless we actually see it in-house, we may not believe it. But the basics are here, and what are your thoughts there? There's a decision to make. Do you want to go with something like the Emotiva BasX range, or what about that Onkyo TX-RZ50 that we looked at? 9 channels of amplification, pretty decent there. Put out good performance. Had Dirac Live in it. That would be a great side-by-side comparison. The Onkyo TX-RZ50 versus the MR1. Where the MR1 is actually more expensive. So do those high quality amplifiers that Emotiva has put into this range really make that the more compelling offer, or you better to save some money and go with the Onkyo? That would be really interesting to do that side by side. So what are your thoughts here? That feedback would be useful to the Ripewave audio community. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And you can take your involvement to the next level by seeing Patreon at www.patreon.com/Ripewave. We now have several options to choose from at different price points, not just at the $10 level, but we also have a $5 level and a $3 level where you can get in and get access to more content than you get from these videos alone. So let me know if that's working for you. Of course, we still have the one-time donation with the thanks button. Several of you have used that, and I really appreciate that. That is very helpful so we can continue here in a strong way. Of course, everybody can hit that bell notification so they're notified when the next video is posted. Until then, keep evolving your audio experience.